Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Procurement in a Digital First Economy, Building Agility and Resilience for Long-Term Success. My name is Paul Blake and I work for GEP, who along with the Hackett Group are the co-sponsors of this session. Before we get started on today's presentation, just 1 or 2 points of housekeeping. Throughout this session you are welcome to submit questions through the Q&A function, and towards the end of the hour we will try to get through as many of those as we can. The most frequently asked question is, can I get a copy of your slides? The answer is yes, of course. We will email you the slides at the end of the session, and a recording of this webinar will be available on our website in a day or so, and we'll let you know. With that said then, let's get into today's session. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Patrick Connaughton, Senior Director of Research at the Hackett Group, and having discussed today's subject with Patrick in some detail, I'm sure you're going to enjoy and get great value out of what he has for us today. Good morning, Patrick. Welcome to the session.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to share our latest thinking in this area, and looking forward to it. Thank you for GEP for hosting today.
You're very welcome. So more from Patrick in just a moment. But of course, no presentation will be complete without the obligatory Who We Are slide, so I'll cover that for GEP very swiftly, I promise. If you don't know who we are, GEP is a global company of procurement experts. With 3 major aspects to our business: procurement consulting, managed services, and procurement software, GEP are uniquely placed in the industry to help complex organizations realize huge value and savings, but looking at procurement in the round. A central theme to today's webinar is the idea that increased procurement agility and ultimately a truly transformed procurement operation results not from looking at any one element in isolation, but taking a much more holistic approach. As you'll see, that's central to how we believe organizations can drive sustainability, agility and resilience into the business and value and savings out. The drive for increased agility and resilience is a necessary step on the road to procurement transformation. And as we will see, there is an irreducible link between the procurement operation of tomorrow and the emerging technology of today. So by way of introduction, I'd like to first set the scene by clarifying some concepts as we understand them. Procurement transformation has arisen in the last couple of years as a powerful idea that speaks to the pressures and impactors on our industry. The volatility and unpredictability in global supply chains and the environment, the rapid change in markets and trade relationships, the requirement potentially for a whole new way of doing business has precipitated a drive to look at procurement with a fresh eye and almost reinvent the operation starting from a clean slate. Digital procurement transformation then represents a step change in how businesses can drive value from spend. It's a radical new approach to procurement process engineering that uses the transformative power of emerging technologies to really drive new sources of value and productivity. But what's this digital business? Well, in recent years, whole swathes of business operations have become dominated by a primarily digital or digital-first approach. It appeared first in media and publishing, the term digital first describing the dramatic and radical, there are those adjectives again, change in the industry and the change that industry underwent, moving from a model where the primary content model was originated for a traditional channel, TV or print or whatever, and then only later syndicated to a digital channel, typically a website. And that has now changed to a model where content is created first and foremost for the digital medium, and if required, pushed back into the traditional channels. So digital first. It recognizes where the consumer is and where the focus should be. This has moved into banking and retail. Nobody's going to enter either sector today and survive without a digital first approach, and this naturally is becoming the de facto standard for business. And it's the position of the consumer, the end user, the practitioner, you, me, all of us, in relation to the service providers that determines the need for a digital-first approach. At its heart, then, digital procurement transformation is made possible through the unification of technology and process to provide not an organic growth in productivity and savings, but a quantum jump in how procurement operations can impact the business. The procurement journey from strategy, opportunity planning through realized value is a road well traveled. And in any procurement transformation, the detailed granular design of the process takes a lot of the brain power. With a traditional approach, though, the software is viewed as just a set of tools or stops along the route where you perform a particular task and then move on. You follow your process and stop here to plan your savings, sometimes later compose an RFP, and then down the road you may do some purchasing and maybe a bit of supplier relationship management. Oh, by the way, anything relating to contracts, well, that's not even procurement's problem. That's something that's done in a completely different place. So technology has been seen as nothing more than labor-saving devices deployed here and there to support an overarching process. There's a problem with that point of view, however, and the problem is us, people. In industry terms, that means users, of course. So however watertight and robust your procurement processes are on paper, the issue is they don't occur on paper. They occur in the real world. And they're conducted by people. And today they are conducted almost exclusively in software. So far from being the steps along the road, the software we use is the road. The conventional wisdom is the most granular processes can be mapped out by experts and are somehow technology agnostic. How can they be technology agnostic? If you have defined a 17-step process and your software doesn't allow you to do steps 14 to 16, your process is not going to work. Gone are the days when people dip in and out of software for small tasks. The whole thing, our whole daily routine, actually happens in software. So the process you will actually be following will be that which the software permits, regardless of what's on paper. So like any transformative process, digital procurement transformation is a profound and fundamental re-engineering of the processes, which must be made possible through the emergence of technologies which are having huge impacts today on society, on our economy, and on us as individuals. Today, there's a greater interaction between humans and software than ever before, and in completely new ways. In procurement, where technology and software used to be a set of ad hoc tools, the software is now the main and often only medium through which procurement is conducted. The process cannot be said to be technology agnostic if the technology is where the process happens. The technology can drive more predictable and measurable outcomes through continual monitoring, and the advent of machine intelligence in the process and in technology has the means to bring trading parties together in real time for much greater collaboration and value creation. And what is clear is that company leaders will need to be at the forefront of digital procurement transformation to drive that agility, to make sure there is that resilience built in. Beyond sponsorship and support, the transformation process will need guidance, leadership, and vision. The traditional approach to business engineering with the realms of people, process, and technology remains relevant. It always has been, and it always will be. Yet the technology today completely encompasses how people work and what they are able to do. Thus, the software and data systems we use can no longer be thought of as tactical tools. The software is the core of our business, and the outcomes are determined not by people or process or technology, but by how effectively those three combine to create a whole. The technologies emerging today that will impact businesses are many and varied, and each one has the potential to be a significant disruptor or is already becoming so. Harnessing the potentially disruptive power of these technologies in a way that can deliver a leap forward in business productivity is the key driver of digital procurement transformation and is the essential element in ensuring agility, sustainability, resilience, robustness, all of those good things for the future. So at this point, I'd really like to hand over to Patrick, who's going to deep dive into some of these areas. And I'm very much looking forward to this next part of the presentation. So Patrick, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what we've put out lately around digital transformation. The Hackett Group runs a survey on an annual basis, and a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with folks today is based on our annual key issues study. Let's jump right into it. So, just to kind of set the stage for procurement, and this is something we measure year over year, when we look at and we ask folks, what are you estimating in terms of both FTE and budget growth going into next year? What you can see on the right-hand side here is that only about 1.4% of growth in FTEs and less than 1% of growth in operating budget is planned into next year. When you compare that to some of the very aggressive revenue growth plans out there, a lot of procurement folks are scratching their head thinking, how are we going to achieve this? How are we going to enable digital transformation when we really are, we're really looking at limited FTE and budget growth? So again, like has been the case for a number of years, we really have to get creative. We really have to think of initiatives that can be self-funding. And we really have to find ways to automate and become more efficient to free up cash to take on some of these projects. Now, when we ask companies every year, we say, what are the most important things? And what are the most important things to you? What are the top 5 things that you're looking at going into next year? And every year, the number one thing is almost always reducing and avoiding purchase cost. For procurement, that's foundational to what we want to do. So the number one thing on this list, reducing and avoiding purchase cost. But the interesting thing, and what's changed over time as we've run this survey, is that things like the number 2 item, improving procurement's business agility, or elevating the role of procurement to a trusted advisor, these are relatively new themes, new priorities for procurement that weren't necessarily on the radar even just a few years ago. So what we're seeing in procurement is this evolution of the role where, yes, reducing and avoiding purchase costs is still the number one priority, but there's other priorities, making a better stakeholder experience, increasing our ability to respond quickly to changing requirements, agility. And so this is kind of the dichotomy that procurement faces. On one hand, we're very cost-focused and efficiency-focused, and on the other hand, we're trying to provide excellent stakeholder service and be more nimble and agile. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to achieve these goals? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about digital transformation as we go through the presentation. Now, we also ask companies not only what are the top 5 things in your list going into this year, but what's changed versus last year? What's more important than it was over the last couple of years? And what was interesting about this is a lot of these same things are in the list as the previous slide. But what's new in this list, the things with the highest change in importance, were first, supporting enterprise digital transformation objectives, and number 2, obtaining more value from P2P. So like I said, we're going to talk about digital transformation and what that means and how we enable it. But the obtaining more value from P2P was also interesting. A lot of clients that we talk to, a lot of folks we talk to in the industry, had sort of put P2P on cruise control. They had figured out how to get it extremely automated, extremely efficient. Some had moved it into a shared service center. And for the most part, they felt like they had really drawn as much out of it as they could. But what we're seeing is that a lot of folks are revisiting P2P. One, because of new technology that's available. Revisiting P2P in the context of, can we use some of this new automation technology to get further efficiencies? And then 2, we're seeing a lot of companies revisit P2P in the context of better linking it to strategic sourcing. So even though P2P sometimes operates in its own bubble, we still want to have a strong linkage to strategic sourcing to ensure that the things like our negotiated savings are actually carrying through to the bottom line. And so again, we're seeing companies really looking to try to better integrate those 2 areas. And in turn, it's becoming a higher priority than it's been the last few years. Now, what we're looking at here, and what this chart shows, is we ask companies, how important are these things, and what's your ability to address them going into next year? So on the y-axis, you see the ability to address. How well positioned are we to actually do something about this? On the x-axis, how important is it to us? Now, we like this view for a couple of reasons. One, if you look at the top right-hand corner there, it shows reducing and avoiding purchase costs as being the most important, but it's also the area that procurement feels like they have the greatest ability to address today. So while it's important, It's not necessarily we focus on in our research and in some of our talks like this. Where we focus is in that bottom right-hand area, the development zone, where things are important, but procurement doesn't necessarily have a high ability to address. What are those things? Obtaining more value from P2P, reducing supply risk, supporting enterprise digital transformation, and improving procurement's business agility. All themes that we've talked about, and these are the key development areas for procurement. Now, how are we going to make this happen? Just another quick view into this. We ask companies, okay, well, what capabilities are you investing in to really make that happen? Things like modernizing the application platform, better aligning skills and talent to changing needs, and improving procurement's analytics, modeling, and reporting capabilities. So these are the areas that we see procurement heavily investing in to try to move the needle. Now let's talk about digital transformation. So Paul did a really nice job of talking about digital first and what digital transformation really means. And a lot of procurement folks, as well as people across the company, view digital transformation as being fundamentally important going forward. And in fact, 89%, shown on this slide on the top row, say that digital transformation will fundamentally change the talent and leadership needs, or will offer step change performance improvements. These are big, powerful words. People feel like there's going to be a fundamental shift based on digital transformation. But when we actually ask companies, how ready are you? What we found was that only about a quarter of folks actually have a strategy for getting there. And only 25% actually have the resources and competencies in place today. So yes, it's important. Yes, it's on the radar. But very few companies actually have a plan or the people in place to make it happen. Now, one of the things we wanted to get a sense for was, how big is this thing? How big is digital transformation? What do people feel like it's going to impact in terms of the scope? We asked companies, okay, well, how many staff do you really see involved in these initiatives? And how many processes do you feel are subject to change? About 29% was the average number of processes that will change potentially or be impacted by digital transformation, and only 13% of staff. And so how do we interpret this? Well, we interpret this as, going forward, a relatively small percentage of procurement people are going to be actively driving this change to about a third of the processes. And that group of people are going to have distinctly different skills going forward. We use words like data scientists, people that are comfortable manipulating massive amounts of information to draw out analytics. We talk about cognitive computing and what that means and understanding how to embrace it. And so that small group of people will have a distinctly different set of skills going forward. Now, I've probably said the terms digital transformation about 53 times so far in this presentation, but we really haven't done much to talk about what it means in terms of real meaningful buckets. So what this slide shows is our framework for enabling digital transformation. And when I sat down to look at this and come up with this framework, one of the things that I realized is that a lot of people are writing about digital transformation out there. A lot of people are talking about digital transformation. But oftentimes it's in the context of a company working with an end consumer, maybe better marketing or selling to an end consumer. And a lot of the frameworks, a lot of the books that have been written about it are really with that sales and marketing vein in mind. What we tried to do is think about it from a back office perspective. What does it mean to procurement? What does it mean to supply chain, finance, IT? And so what we've created are these pillars, or these different groups that we feel like build on a lot of the work that's been done around digital transformation in sales and marketing, but also apply these concepts better to the back office. So what are the key principles? Number one, improving the stakeholder experience. So how can we better use digital technology to improve the stakeholder experience? How can we build a better personal omni-channel experience? How can we measure our value proposition beyond savings? And how can we look at and better segment our stakeholder community so that we're giving them what they need, when they want it, in the terms or in the format that they are expecting. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The second area is orchestrating procurement as a service. So the portfolio of services that procurement offers, how do we better orchestrate that? How do we better raise awareness around what procurement does and then organize ourselves in a way that we can very quickly deliver services to our stakeholders? The third area, and at the core of it all, is setting a foundation of insight-driven analytics. So how can we better build up our analytics as a core competency in procurement? How can we create analytics centers of excellence and special project teams? How can we deliver market intelligence as a service? How can we better mitigate risk through things like predictive forecasting? And then last but not least, it's about leveraging technology. And here, we intentionally have technology as last. It's not that it's less important, but we really want to talk first about the stakeholder experience, how we organize, how we use analytics, and then technology is an enabler for all of that. So how can we build the right technology infrastructure and platform to make sure that we're positioned for digital transformation? How can we find the right mix of niche versus platform solutions? How can we build flexibility into our technology roadmap so as things change, we can take advantage of it and move quickly? And as procurement and sourcing executives, how can we not only use technology ourselves, but how can we better source technology for the organization? How can we become smarter in areas like cloud contracts? Or what does cognitive mean to the organization? How can procurement have a point of view on that and on the supply base that does it to educate the company? So these are the four main areas of enabling digital transformation that we talk about. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through each of these four areas over the next 20 minutes or so here. So the first area is improving the stakeholder experience. Now, when we talk about the stakeholder experience, one of the key things that we really want to focus on first is better managing and measuring performance and business value. So a lot of folks out there will use Net Promoter Scores. Maybe you have a survey that happens after each sourcing event to determine how well you did. But the key thing here is to very aggressively track and measure and act on stakeholder satisfaction surveys. And not just limit it to stakeholder satisfaction surveys, but also do in-person interviews, in-person meetings to see what's really happening out there and are we doing a good job. So first and foremost, improving the stakeholder experience means we need to start measuring it and have actionable plans on what we're going to do with that feedback. Now, we also talk about this concept of an omni-channel and personalized stakeholder experience. What do we mean by omni-channel? Well, for those of you like myself that kind of came up through the dot-com days, omni-channel was a big word at the time when a lot of the brick and mortar companies were bringing they're selling online and getting into e-commerce. And so maybe these companies before had a catalog, a printed catalog, and they had a storefront, and they were trying to emulate and that brand and that experience through their e-commerce experience. And so they talked about this omni-channel experience where the brand was consistent, where the experience was consistent, regardless of whether you were interacting through a website, a help desk, catalog. And this same concept can be applied to procurement and how we work with our stakeholders. What is our brand? What do we want to be viewed as by our stakeholders? And when they call our phone support, when they visit our help desk, when they go to our web portal, email, messaging, our newsletters, maybe you have chat support, does it offer a consistent experience across all of those channels? And have you thought through, based on your stakeholders and the different profiles that they have, which channels you're going to provide to them? For some stakeholders, they're going to want to have access to information maybe in the middle of the night on a mobile device. Others are going to want to call somebody and talk to a real person. And the key thing is to segment your stakeholders, understand who they are, and then begin mapping these different omni-channels to that experience. And so a very important point as we talk about developing a more digital experience for stakeholders. Now, orchestrating a procurement as a service portfolio. What's that all about? Well, first and foremost, at least for sourcing, it's around where do we source things and how do we do it? So organizationally, how are we aligned? Most companies that we talk to have some sort of center-led approach where our centralized group is responsible for certain things and standards, and then maybe regionally there's different responsibilities and locally there's other responsibilities. So how do we organize in a way that we can optimize that local, regional, and global procurement operations? And Paul talked about agility and becoming more agile. The way that we organize is absolutely critical in how we become more agile, because if you're offering some type of local procurement services, those are the ones that might be able to respond fastest. But you might not be able to drive the same level of savings locally. So there's a trade-off. Now, we also talked about P2P. And when it comes to P2P, one of the things that we are seeing is this idea of revisiting the value proposition. So on the right-hand side here, we have this process cost reduction. And this has been sort of the historic focus of P2P. How do we make it cheaper to run these processes? But what we're seeing is companies gravitating towards the middle and the left-hand side in P2P. How do we realign to reduce maverick spending? How do we reduce non-compliance? How do we look at DPO improvements? And then ultimately, how do we protect our brand? How do we manage supply risk? How do we manage the opportunity cost? And so, again, re-looking at P2P and the value drivers is very, very important, especially in the context of digital transformation. So as we revisit P2P, what is our goal beyond just automation? How do we enable that? Now, when it comes to how we're organized, this concept of a center of excellence comes up time and time again. Now, a center of excellence can be just a specialized, localized team that has very specific tasks. And so, for example, we see companies setting up analytics centers of excellence, reporting centers of excellence. It can also be part of a shared service center or a global business services. The key thing is that it's a dedicated group of people that are responsible for these tasks. What are these tasks? Well, historically, you can see on this slide, the top three activities are things like technology support, so supporting the technology that we use for sourcing and procurement. Maybe they're doing some measurements of performance and reporting, and some compliance activities. But increasingly, we see new things being expanded into centers of excellence on the bottom here. Things like catalog and guided buying content management, supplier performance management, and project and continuous improvement activities. And so the idea of having a centralized continuous improvement team within procurement that's managing these projects, above and beyond just using a COE for reporting and technology support. Going forward, we actually see some even more interesting things emerging out of COEs. So here we asked, what are you kind of currently in place or expanding on? Things like analytics, things like supply market intelligence, cognitive procurement, robotic process automation. So again, this concept of a centralized COE is a very powerful tool, not only for procurement, but for any organization, to get focused around specific activities, but also provide consistent results with some level of control over them. Now, outsourcing is certainly another tool when it comes to procurement's toolkit in terms of how they're organized. And we ask companies, what do you use BPO providers for today? And interestingly, the number one thing was supply market intelligence. So companies are using their BPO provider to help them quickly gain category intelligence, aggregate and maybe pull together secondary sources, all the data that's out there, and provide a point of view that you can then use to help educate your own stakeholders. So managing that process. We also see technology support as being common, and that's no surprise. But the third area is absolutely important. Tactical sourcing for indirect materials. So tactical sourcing, so going out and for spend below a certain spend threshold, non-strategic type of non-recurring spend, using an outsourcing provider to help manage that through the process. This is an area referred to typically as tail spend, and we do see some benefits here in having someone potentially do this for you at a much lower cost than doing it yourself. So let's talk about analytics for a minute. And I'm just going to pause and look at the Q&A. Okay, we're fine. So I'm going to look at analytics here for a minute and talk a little bit about what we mean and when we talk about analytics, what we're really focused on. So we ask companies, what over last year, what is more important a priority in 2017 than in 2016? And the number one area reported here was improving procurement, analytical, modeling, and reporting capabilities. So I think this gives you a sense for how important this really is. Everyone is talking about analytics. And there's a lot of drivers for that, right? I mean, we have access to a ton more data than we ever had. Storage, for the most part, is cheap, and processing speed is much faster than it's ever been. So we actually have access to more data in a lot of cases than we know how to use. And so how do we sift through that noise? How do we make something of that? And that's really the biggest challenge when we talk about analytics today. Now, this is a fairly standard continuum that I've seen different versions of out there, and we all have one of them. And it basically shows this evolution of business intelligence, going from reporting to analysis to monitoring to forecasting, all the way up to predicting. And a lot of companies are really just at the analysis and monitoring stage today. They're really not doing much in the way of predicting and forecasting. And in some ways that's okay, because one of the things that we found is as you go up this continuum, it gets more expensive, it gets more complex, it requires different skill sets, and you really want to be very deliberate about what you're actually trying to predict. So if you ask yourself, if you ask your stakeholders, if you could predict better or forecast better one thing that would change your job, what is it? And if they can't answer that question, then you're much better off taking a step back, running workshops, getting involved with the business, better understanding what the art of the possible might be before embarking on a business intelligence or a big data project. You want to lead with what are those questions we're trying to answer, not with what's the technology platform that's going to enable it. I think a lot of companies approach that backwards. Now, we'd be amiss if we didn't talk about big data in the context of analytics. And when we talk about big data, there's really these four characteristics that have changed the way we talk about analytics. Volume, much higher volumes of information. Velocity, so this concept of streaming data, not just in a database or a data pool. It's this idea of a stream that has real-time feeds that you try to tap into and take advantage of. Veracity, so the uncertainty of the data. As we open this up to more external sources and we begin taking in information that doesn't come from our own structured database, well, there's a lot more uncertainty than there ever was. And then the variety of the data. It's going to be much different than just one or two sources. It's across hundreds of sources and figuring out how do we do something with this. Now, the key thing and the point that I made before is that a big data strategy starts with first understanding where to focus the investment. Ask that question, what is the art of the possible? What are we trying to achieve? What is that one burning question that if I could answer, I would be able to do my job better? Maybe I'm a commodity manager. Maybe I deal with something like the fluctuation in dairy prices, and I need to get a better view into how that volatility has changed over time, will change in the future, and will impact our business. Or maybe I need a better understanding of what the political climate and the business climate looks like in a specific region of the world because I'm thinking about doing business there or I'm thinking about sourcing there, but I need a better understanding of where this is going. And so there's questions that people have that we need answered. Now, we also talk about risk in the context of analytics. And here we ask companies, so going into next year, what is the biggest projected increase in risk and in what areas are you going to see it? Interestingly enough, on the left-hand side of this chart, the number one area was cyber and information security risk. Now remember, these are procurement and sourcing folks answering this question. The number one risk was around cyber and information security. So increasingly, procurement and sourcing are being asked to understand the implications of cyber risk. What does it mean to how we vet suppliers? What does it mean to how we make sure that suppliers are compliant? What requirements do we need to consider? How do we need to work with our own IT department as we qualify these suppliers? So procurement and sourcing are being forced to understand what this is all about. Now, other forms of risk are still on the radar, of course, things like regulatory risk, access to critical talent, IP theft, exchange rate volatility. And historically, these are the types of things that procurement has been concerned with. But that cyber risk is key, especially in the concept of digital transformation. And as we look to go down this path, how do we make sure that we aren't opening ourselves up to more exposure when it comes to risk? A good example is mobility and mobile devices. You know, we think about digital transformation, and certainly access to a mobile device, to a tablet, is part of that. But with mobile devices comes risk, comes data sensitivity, and how is that secured? So the last area I'm going to talk about, and then pass it back to Paul, is around leveraging technology to accelerate transformation. And I'll talk about a couple of things that we learned as part of this study. So I showed you this before, but when we came to some of the improvement programs that people had in place, a large percentage of folks, about half, are looking to modernize their procurement application platform going into the next couple of years. Now, what does modernize really mean? Well, for some, it means migrating from a licensed, installed product to a software as a service product in the cloud. For some, it means moving away from a business intelligence tool that you host to a cloud-based business intelligence tool where you can take advantage of the newest slicing and dicing features on a tablet. To some, it means just simplifying the buying experience. So moving away from rigid forms that require a ton of data to more of an Amazon-like buying experience, a single click, if needed, to be able to find and buy things. So modernizing the application portfolio takes on a lot of different flavors. Now, a couple of things that we learned that were interesting as part of this work was, one, 32% of the folks that took the survey said, you know what, we would really like to consolidate all source-to-pay applications onto a single platform provider. We still have disparate tools in place today. So about a third of the folks that took this said, we'd like to get to a single provider, but we just haven't been able to get there today. Only about 8% have actually gotten there, based on the people that took this. Single provider, no disparate systems, and so there's still a ways to go when it comes to achieving this end-to-end source-to-pay single provider vision. We get asked this question a lot, and so it was great to get some data around this to see where things are really at. Now, when it comes to the end-to-end source-to-pay landscape, I like to use this slide when I talk about software in the source-to-pay space. Everyone calls these things different things. This is what we call them at the Hackett Group. It gives us a way of talking through it to make sure we're all using the same terminology. It starts with automated spend analysis on the left-hand side, goes to e-sourcing, contract lifecycle management, e-procurement, services procurement, e-invoicing, and along the top, supplier lifecycle management. We intentionally break services procurement out because it tends to be a totally different animal, and we do have a lot of folks that are using a different tool for that entirely. But I have contract lifecycle management highlighted here because it's at the very center of this end-to-end landscape. But what we find is that it's very often not integrated, both from a process and from a systems perspective in this overall landscape. And contract lifecycle management, we feel, is one of the most underutilized areas within this whole landscape. And so one of the things we've been focusing a lot of our research on is how do companies move forward in contract lifecycle management? How do they better integrate it with these other tools? And how do they take advantage of some of the features that are out there? Not only to store contracts in a repository, but to have better terms and conditions libraries, to better manage and monitor performance against that contract so that you can report on how well procurement is doing overall. If you can't measure compliance against the contract, then it's very, very difficult for us to talk about what are we doing as a procurement organization, how successful are we? So we actually asked the question, and this is a great slide as a takeaway for folks. We asked the question, for the people that have implemented contract lifecycle management software, what are the benefits that you actually found? So companies told us that they were able to reduce the amount of time required to find a contract by 52%, reduce the number of lapse contracts by 39%, increase the use of standard conditions by 38%, and we go down this list. We wanted to get a sense for how big is the reward here. And I think it's interesting at the very top that this idea of reducing the amount of time to find a contract, or cutting it in half practically, was the #1 benefit. It may seem like a small benefit, but I can tell you that I've talked to companies who've based their entire ROI around the ability to find the contract quickly. A lot of folks are dealing with thousands of contracts, some of them in filing cabinets and stored in different locations. And without a contract ID, they had no way of actually searching for and finding that contract. And it took days or weeks to get what they needed back. With these tools, we can use keyword searches to find the contracts we need. We can pull multiple contracts at once very quickly based on keywords. And that alone is a really important feature. But it doesn't stop there. There's a lot of really advanced features too, and here you can see some of the benefits. So we love this slide, and it's a great takeaway for people that are thinking about contract lifecycle management. A couple more slides here. One of the things that we also asked was just in terms of emerging technology, what do you see growing the most over the next 2 to 3 years? And things like cognitive computing, robotic process automation, the Internet of Things, mobile computing, social media are all on the list. The #1 area was cloud-based applications. And here, I think there's really 2 big implications to procurement. One is how can we potentially find cloud-based tools that can help us better do our jobs? But 2, what do we need to do to become experts in cloud-based contracts? There's a lot of things to think about when going down the path of a cloud contract or a software as a service contract with a provider. And there's best practices and lessons learned around that we can use. And so we have to become smarter in both of those areas. And then last but not least, we asked that question another way. We just asked, okay, so what are you piloting? What are you currently piloting and what's happening in your organization? And here, what I think is interesting is at the very center. Robotic process automation. And some of you have seen this in the news. Some of you have seen different articles on robotic process automation. And the question has always been, who's really doing it? And the interesting thing is that a quarter of the companies that took this survey are actually in the process of piloting or had already rolled out some form of robotic process automation. What we found is that a lot of those implementations tend to be on the invoice processing side of the house. But increasingly, companies are looking at how do we go upstream and do maybe more intelligent sourcing using these tools? How do we streamline that process? And that's going to be really in development over the next few years here. So that's our framework for digital transformation, improving the stakeholder experience, orchestrating this portfolio of services, setting a foundation of analytics, and ultimately leveraging technology to help pull it all together. Hopefully that was helpful for folks as you think about digital transformation and what your strategy is and how you might organize your thoughts. And with that, I'm actually going to pass it to Paul so that he can kind of wrap us up and talk about a few key takeaways.
Patrick, thank you. That's absolutely fantastic stuff, and I hope you agree, folks. There were some really, really good insights there. And I've been scribbling down some notes because I have a few things to finish off with, but I also want to pick up on some of the things that you said, Patrick, and also to attempt to answer some of the questions that have been posed as you've been speaking. We are already seeing the transformative power of these technologies on procurement, and I'd like to sort of tease out just three items that you've already spoken about, Patrick, and give the GEP perspective on what we're seeing going on. One of the key areas of development is the arrival of this notion of the modernized application platform. We call it a unified source-to-pay platform. The unified platform is designed for active user engagement, delivers the insight and the analysis from those vast data sets through the ever-growing interaction with a range of different devices. And the idea is to give control over compliance and utilization and risk to deliver that step change in productivity. And with the emergence of things like digital printing, on-demand fabrication, there is in prospect a new industrial revolution. We believe that a unified workspace which combines people, process, technology at the heart is really the core of our experience of the future. So these technology drivers are going to result in real breakthrough performance if we approach it right. So digitally transformed procurement, as we see it, is a coming together of people, process, and software in a way that's truly synergistic. The procurement practitioner will be working to a new type of process flow by interacting with the business environment in an intuitive and natural way. No longer hampered or frustrated by the limitations of software, they can move, say, from opportunity identification, automated research in that big data environment, to planning, to supplier negotiation, to contracting, with no barriers, no delays, and no loss of informational integrity. The unified workspace in which procurement operates is the same space accessed by suppliers and buyers across the enterprise, across the extended enterprise, and each person's view will be tailored to their own requirements. The document handling, checking, authorization in the rec-to-check cycle will be fully automated, with only the most exceptional exceptions requiring human intervention. And this is all made possible today because that unified workspace is built on a platform that synthesizes the big data, the artificial intelligence, the automation, and the heuristic analysis, which in the cloud places access onto every device. And at GEP, we make digital procurement transformation possible through our expertise in procurement people, procurement process, and procurement technology. And we know that a truly transformative process cannot ignore any one of those aspects. It's the holistic unified approach which is required to create the procurement operation of the future. So those three key areas that I'd like to dive into that are really driving this kind of transformation are this unification of the source-to-pay task flow, the big data area of AI and machine learning, and the advent of mobile and cloud. So to explain what unified software means, I'd just like to reiterate the process that Patrick laid out a bit earlier and look at a typical procurement process from source to pay. Of course, we have the analysis of the big data, looking at opportunities, looking for those sources of new value. Which then moves on to plans and strategies to deliver the value identified, which through the practices of sourcing and negotiation, those plans can be executed to set up the contracts, which are what I like to think of as the vehicles for value. With the contracts in place, the value set up during negotiation can be exploited, so the relationship with the supplier must be managed so that those contract terms are complied with, and so that the pricing and delivery and service are all within the planned limits. But it also means the value results from when the contracts are used by you and by your colleagues. So it's only here that the savings, the value that you set up through the whole procurement process is actually realized. The rest of the process has all been about creating the potential for savings. And it's here where that potential becomes reality. But here's the issue. This process can and does break down. Of course, it can break down at any point. If you fail to plan, or if you fail to act on the plans, or you run your RFIs but never make a decision as a result of the proposals, then you will fail. But assuming that you know how to do procurement, then you can get to the contract readily enough. But failing to manage the supplier relationships correctly, and more importantly, failing to actually use the contracts, are the most common reasons why savings are never realized. The potential cannot be actualized if all the hard work your people have put into creating the vehicles for value isn't exploited. So this is what has been typically done when companies consider implementing software for procurement and purchasing. With separate standalone tools for some of these different functions, you can kind of see the rationale. Running your RFPs is something that procurement teams need to be good at, but day-to-day buyers don't need to know anything about. And in procurement's natural territory, from source to contract, the procurement professionals can pretty much get by. But reaching the contract with supplier is absolutely not the realization of the value. And really interestingly, as Patrick, as you presented the list of benefits of putting in a state-of-the-art CLM tool, there was one that was totally not on that list, which is, did it improve the utilization of the contract? Were all the vehicles for value that were set up in the contracts actually exploited across the organization? And this approach of disconnected software completely disconnects the good work procurement does from the rest of the business. And the different software systems can actually exacerbate that disconnection and make it extremely difficult for the potential to be actualized. And it's not because one piece of software may be missing a feature. It's because the technology itself perpetuates a fundamental breakdown in the source-to-pay process. But there is a received wisdom in the software industry. Procurement as a function, and thus the associated technology, is divided into upstream and downstream. And they represent two different worlds, two fundamentally separate hemispheres. Upstream, we have our procurement professionals who day in and day out are using software and analytics to do all that stuff that Patrick has looked at. That's their day job, it's core activity, and a good percentage of the users upstream are power users, if you like. But downstream is everyone else in the business. They don't know or care particularly about categories and savings targets. They just need a particular commodity or service. And using procurement software is something that they do ad hoc now and again. And they don't need to know how everything in the software works. So the conventional wisdom is, therefore, you must have different software for these two groups, and it has become dogmatic. You must have different providers for sourcing and P2P. It stands to reason. But what we've seen is that the very separation of procurement and purchasing undermines the ability to deliver the results. It puts an artificial break, an artificial wall between that negotiated contract and the purchasing system that is supposed to deliver the value. This means all the potential set up by procurement has to be forcibly manhandled into the purchasing system, and the rest of the business has to be actively forced to be compliant with the contracts to use them, because the software doesn't permit a natural process. But if you dispense with the notions of upstream and downstream and look at the process and business value as a unified requirement, you can dramatically improve the source-to-pay process as a whole. So unifying source-to-contract and procure-to-pay is the core of the transformation program. It's suddenly much easier to drive value out of the hard negotiated contracts. It means you can rewrite the rule book. There are things that you do now that you will not have to do in a unified world, a transformed world. And this is where the agility and the resilience comes from. With contract utilization and compliance and supplier performance recorded at source, because every order that is raised is automatically tracked back to the contract it's associated with, you suddenly don't have to do all of these processes. You will also be able to do things tomorrow that you cannot do today, is monitor the performance against your contract and against your savings plans in real time, which dramatically increases the speed to value and actually allow the procurement operation to manage purchasing. Artificial intelligence is changing the way in which analysis and reporting happens. But more importantly, it's changing the type and the level of intelligence available and the accuracy and validity of these analyses. The heuristic conversational interaction with the software that's possible today is radically changing the decision process and the speed to value. With the limited time left, I can't go into this in great detail, but there are huge advances in that whole unified world that are coming from the application of AI, machine learning, and big data analysis to really allow the individual operators in the organization to gain more accurate and more timely insights for decision support and for value generation. And there is an element of confluence here with the third pillar, if you like, of this argument, which is about the use of mobile. Mobile is not about just doing what you're doing today, but somewhere else. It's about the ability to sit down, a category manager to sit down with a supplier and to pull that data through the AI engine to the desktop with the supplier to actively negotiate, to actively mitigate risk, to actively monitor the relationship and manage the sources of value going forwards. So mobile collaboration facilitated through the cloud and so on are dramatic, profound, and far-reaching. From a new paradigm of insight and visibility to releasing the potential of your people instead of shackling them with labor-intensive processes and tasks, to much more rapid and accurate decision-making, driving greater results, competitive and durability for the enterprise, this new possibility of digital procurement transformation is going to be a dramatic step change for the business. So at that point, we have just under 5 minutes left. I'd like to get on to being able to answer some of your questions. Patrick, is there anything there that has caught your eye that you would like to get started with?
No, go ahead and pick which ones you think are most relevant for the next couple minutes. I haven't.
Okay, absolutely. There was one that I thought that was particularly interesting, which was a question about what skills will the procurement professional of the future need compared with today? And I think that's it's quite an insightful question because let me give you an example as to why that caught my eye while you were speaking. I had a conversation a little while ago with somebody in the industry, and we were talking about the emergence of as you described earlier, Patrick, the Amazon-like experience. It's a very common used phrase, but the idea of making business software, procurement software, as easy to use as any of the other devices we have. And this individual said to me, and it was, I actually wrote it down, but I won't quote you verbatim. It was such an amazing statement. He said, you know, what you want to be usable, you don't want to be too usable because anybody could then come in and do the job. And I think that's a really interesting statement. It's a damning indictment of the software industry in total. It's also a bit of an indictment of us as the users of software. Expecting powerful and complicated software to be difficult to use, and for somehow that being the reason why we are valued in our jobs. And I think the skills for the procurement professional in the future will actually be those skills that we value today and not the ones that people spend most time using, which is the ability to use software. I think it will be about innovating in the supply chain, about organizing and managing relationships with suppliers, and the skills of the future will not be IT skills and how to use software, because that piece will be much more transparent and much easier to manage. Patrick, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, you know, I was interviewing a CPO a couple of weeks ago, and what he said was that procurement folks need to become data scientists and innovation scouts. And I thought that was really interesting, and I've been thinking about it since then. You know, what does that really mean, you know, to become a data scientist? And, you know, he was saying that he's hiring for statistics. He's hiring for data modeling. He's not necessarily hiring for category expertise or understanding the order process. And so, you know, that was interesting. The other was this idea of innovation scouts, you know, being out there and actively trying to find and vet and qualify new solutions, and, you know, being the ones that bring new ideas and thought leadership to the table. and not leaving that to the business. And so it was a few things that were top of mind based on that discussion.
Very good. I think we're pretty much out of time. We have just a few seconds left.
I'm not sure if Paul has gone mute for everyone, but I can't hear him. So I just wanted to say thank you for everyone who attended today. We have our contact information in the presentation that we can show you here. So you're welcome to contact either myself or Paul. And our email addresses are there if you have questions. I believe they're going to send the slides out afterwards. And with that, thank you very much for attending.